Okay, so this is the addendum. And so for the exam that is coming up, you need to know what these 4 toxins, I told you there's going to be like very few, okay? You need to know which species they belong to. So I can ask you a question. A toxin of Bordetella Pertussis, without naming it. Am I clear? Or a toxin of Crinibacterium diphtheria, without naming what this toxin is. And then you need to know the effects. So, inhibition of protein synthesis for diphtheria toxin, inhibition of protein synthesis, okay, also protein synthesis inhibition, and leading to hemolytic uremic syndrome and dysentery. Shiga toxin, cholera. That's typo, cyclic AMP. I'm sorry, I didn't notice it. Okay, so it stimulates adenylate cyclase, which leads to the increased production of cyclic AMP and increased secretion in the intestinal epithelium, and pneumolysin of Bordetella Pertussis, destruction of ciliated epithelium in the lower respiratory tract. And finally, 3 groups of 3 microbes. The most common causes of neonatal meningitis: Streptogalactae, Listeria acetogenus, E. coli. Community-acquired meningitis: Neisseria meningitidis, Streptococcus pneumonia, Haemophilus influenza. And 3 spore-forming bacteria: Bacilli, Clostridia, Coxiella burnetii. Does that make sense? So notice, like, I can ask you, like, which of the following is the common cause of neonatal meningitis? And I throw in, I consider it to help you out, which of the following gram-positive bacteria? Does that make sense? So I can ask you this, gram-positive. And then you look at the list and you think, okay, these 2 are gram-negatives. So he's not asking about these 2, he's asking about these 2. Am I clear? And please remind me to post the, I have flashcards for gram-positive, gram-negative. The online flashcards. You can play them on the computer, you can play them on your phone, there's an app for it, okay? Like, it's like, what's the word? Huh? Like Quizlet, but it's just different website and different app, okay? Any questions about this addendum? Real good? Okay. So now let's talk about the actual study guide. So I organized it in a way that first you have a bunch of gram-positives, and next you have a bunch of gram-negatives. So that's focus, please, on the transmission, and I will clarify it. So it's gram-positive transmission with the food, poultry, eggs, milk, GI disease, gastroenteritis. If it's GI, it's usually diarrhea or vomiting. You know, here it is. Disease that Listeria acetogenus causes in infants, neonatal meningitis. Okay? Biological method of control, bacteriophage. Okay? What we talked about. So mycobacteria, they are technically gram-positive, but they have mycolic acid on the outside. Remember that. Okay? Can you use gram staining to identify? No. You would use acid-fast staining. Transmission routes for Mycobacterium leprae: respiratory or contact from person to person. Okay? You can also acquire it by contact route from armadillos. Cells, it infects macrophages, and cytotoxicity like CD8 cells or macrophages, they contribute to the pathogenesis. They lead to formation of granulomas and destruction of the connective tissue. Mycobacterium leprae causes leprosy, so tuberculoid form and lepromatous form. Remember what I told you before about terminology. Do not invent your own terms. Okay? So two forms, tuberculoid and lepromatous. Lepromatous is more severe. Okay? Leprosy can be treated. Remember, you do not need to know any of the treatment protocols for any of the diseases. Did I make myself clear? Okay? You need to know if there is a vaccine or not, and so far we never had a vaccine. Okay? Nocardia, technically gram-positive, but since it does have mycolic acid, acid-fast staining. Transmission routes for nocardia, it's nosocomially transmitted, commonly found in soil, so nosocomial conditions. Respiratory, pneumonia, cardiovascular, endocarditis. Does that make sense? So, gram-positive, the most common transmission route is respiratory. Basically, we consider Crinibacterium diphtheria a respiratory pathogen. It causes diphtheria, symptoms, pseudomembrane formation, and cough, and it's a respiratory disease. There's a vaccine. Pseudomembrane is the assemblage of dead white blood cells, dead epithelial cells, and dead bacterial cells, and red blood cells. Cellular effects, inhibition of the protein synthesis. Am I clear? Gram-positive, it is found in the human microbiome in the mouth. So transmission routes, usually auto-inoculation or self-inoculation. Does that make sense? So it just spreads from the mouth. Cardiovascular condition, endocarditis. Oral pathological condition, gingivitis. For this infection, it's immunocompromised. Gardnerella vaginalis causes bacterial vaginosis. Disease that is associated with that microorganism is Gardnerellosis, genosis. It is found in the human microbiome, in the vagina. Proposed mechanism, antibiotic treatment, eradicates lactobacilli from the mucosal membrane that allows Gardnerella to grow out, causing vaginosis. Okay? So positive, it's a component of the gut microbiome. Transmission route, nosocomial. Okay? Either it can be self-inoculation or nosocomial from person to person. Urinary tract disease. If I ask you urinary, it's UTI always. Cardiovascular disease, endocarditis. Extensive antibiotic resistance of Enterococcus faecalis is due to the exposure to antibiotics since it's present in the gut. Propionibacterium acnes positive. It's a component of the skin microbiome. Nutrient source, sebum. Growth accelerated during the host puberty. Hormones. We produce a lot of sebum when we are in the puberty period. Does that make sense? Oily skin. Acne. Mechanism, overgrowth of bacteria due to massive levels of sebum being produced. Mycococcus luteus, positive, found in the skin, pneumonia, endocarditis, severely immunocompromised patients. Structural feature of mycoplasma. No cell wall, That's walking pneumonia. Well, transmission route is obviously respiratory. Mycoplasma genitalium causes STD, sexually transmitted disease. Transmission route is, well, it's STD. Now, bifidobacteria. Gram-positive, gut and vagina. That's where you can find it. You can acquire this bacterium from food. Staining for lactobacilli positive. Same gut and vagina, that's where you find it. And yes, you can acquire it from food. What is probiotic? Microorganism that stimulates the healthy population of healthy microorganisms in the gut. They can ameliorate inflammatory bowel disease. Okay. Staining for leukonostoc positive. You can acquire it from food. It can be pathogenic in immunocompromised patients. What type of metabolism? Remember, these three microorganisms. What's common between them? They all gram-positive. They all probiotic. And they all are fermenting microorganisms. Does that make sense so far? Good? Hold on. Okay. So from now on, if you don't mind, unless noted, I'm not gonna say staining because it's gonna be big gram-negative story, okay? So Bartonella henselae, cat scratch fever. That's a nice acronym right there. Cat scratch fever, transmission route from animals, from cats, but can be also transmitted by ticks and lice. No, there's no vaccine. Okay. Complications, hepatitis biliosis. That's it. Staining for Bartonella quintana, transmission route from animals. Bartonella quintana, causative agent of trench fever, lice carry it. There's no vaccine, so trench fever. Brucella abortus, causative agent of brucellosis or undulant fever or Maltese fever or Banks fever. Now, since when I write, I have some stuff in mind. If you're not sure and you think there is a synonym for the name of the infection and you don't know if there is one, come to me and ask me. If there is one, like if I accidentally wrote Banks fever and you're not sure, because brucellosis is the one that I want you to know, okay? You can come to me and say, is there a synonym for that disease? And I will tell you, yes. Brucellosis, Banks fever, and Maltese fever is all the same. Does that make sense? So don't worry about it. Transmission route from cattle, okay? There's no vaccine. Well, when I say no vaccine, we always refer to general public. In fact, there is one that is used for people who work with cattle at risk. Does that make sense? Well, brucellosis, characteristic symptom, undulant fever, intermittent fever. Reservoir is cattle. Okay, so Rickettsia, Coxiella, and Ehrlichia, common. In the wild, not in the lab, in the wild, they are intracellular pathogen. Meaning that they replicate inside the cell. Not just they can go into the cell. They replicate inside the cell. Am I clear? Rickettsia rickettsii, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, transmission route ticks, Rickettsia provazii, typhus, Coxiella burnetii, Q fever, from animals, can be animals, mostly domestic. Virulence factor, if you see survival under harsh environmental conditions and its bacteria, endospore. Ehrlichia causes ehrlichiosis, transmission route ticks. Am I clear? You do not need to know, for instance, that Ehrlichia phagocytophila infects monocytes. Does that make sense? Chlamydia trachomatis. Another, and look, if I stress so much on obligate intracellular parasite, it's got to mean something, right? Like for the exam. Disease in adults, chlamydiasis, transmission route, sexually transmitted disease. In newborns, it can cause trachoma. Transmission route is from mother to child when the child passes through the birth canal. So far, we're clear? Any questions? Bordetella pertussis causes pertussis or whooping cough. Okay. The mechanism for this disease is that the toxin, the pneumolysin of Bordetella pertussis, destroys the epithelium of the lower respiratory tract. Absence of functional epithelium and functional cilia allows mucus to stay there, and that leads to irritation of the lower respiratory tract and cough. Are we clear? Transmission route, well, respiratory, and we do have a vaccine. 3 stages. We have catarrhal, we have paroxysmal, we have convalescent. During the catarrhal stage, microorganism replicates, and you don't know that you have whooping cough. And then when catarrhal stage is over, paroxysmal stage starts, but microorganism is largely gone. Does that make sense? Since it's largely gone, antibiotics have very limited efficacy against the whooping cough. So far, does that make sense? Another name for Neisseria meningitis. It's meningococcus. It causes meningitis in adults, community acquired. Cutaneous clinical feature distinguishing Neisseria meningitis infection from other meningitis diseases. This is petechia on the limbs. Okay. Transmission route, respiratory, we do have a vaccine. Neisseria gonorrhea in adults causes gonorrhea. Transmission route, it's STD. In newborns, conjunctivitis or ophthalmia neonatorum. Transmission route from the mother, mucosal membranes, birth canal. Good so far? All Enterobacteriaceae present in the microbiome, and all of them are transmitted in the nosocomial settings. All of them infect mainly immunocompromised patients. Now, here's the deal. Basically, you have like respiratory tract, nothing fascinating. If it's not super specific, like pertussis or diphtheria, disease of respiratory tract is going to be pneumonia. Disease of cardiovascular system is going to be endocarditis. Disease of the CNS, meningitis. Microorganisms rarely make it all the way to the brain to cause encephalitis. Meninges are within the reach, though. Does that make sense? So, Enterobacter aerogenes, pneumonia. Klebsiella, pneumonia, wound infection, renal system UTI. Proteus mirabilis, UTI. Serratia marcescens, wound infections, UTI. Does that make sense? Now I want to particularly stress the importance of E. coli. E. coli is the leading cause of urinary tract infections. In the GI, it's diarrhea. Okay? Now, EHEC. This one I specifically focus on. EHEC stands for enterohemorrhagic E. coli. Severe systemic disease is hemolytic uremic syndrome. The most common source, when I say the most common source, I refer to the transmission. The most common source is food. The virulence factors responsible for the pathogenesis are Shiga toxins 1 and 2. So hemolytic uremic syndrome, just know what happens. So hemolysis of red blood cells leads to the kidney failure, accumulation of urea in the blood. So you have hemolytic uremic syndrome. Dysentery, blood in the stool. And in newborns, it causes neonatal meningitis. E. coli can be found in the human microbiome, in the gut. Common transmission routes, fecal, oral, and nosocomial, self-inoculation. Shigella, shigellosis, inhibition of the protein synthesis. Transmission route, fecal, oral. Okay. Salmonella. Common sources for salmonella infection. So it's eggs, poultry, milk. Disease, salmonellosis, enteritis, typhoid fever, the severe form of salmonellosis. Okay, we're going to write down typhoid fever just to make it more specific. Salmonella can be transmitted from human to human, rarely, and it can be carried asymptomatically. So, yes and yes. Which environmental conditions are preferred? Salt, brackish, water. It can replicate outside of the host. So Vibrio can grow independently. Wound infection, transmission route from the water or from the shellfish. Vibrio cholerae causes cholera. Symptoms, profuse diarrhea. Geographical distribution. Look, I'm not going to ask you if is cholera endemic in Benin, but understanding that it's mainly Africa and Southeast Asia, mainly India, that's all I ask. Okay? Mechanism. So, activation of adenylate cyclase, increased production of CAMP, intestinal secretion, diarrhea. Okay? What contributes the most to the transmission? Unsanitary conditions, lack of the proper water treatment. Water filtration through the ceramic cloth. Remember we talked about it. Vibrio cholerae bacteria hitch the right on the copypods. You filter out copypods, you filter out one of the main reservoirs for infection. Okay. Yersinia enterocolitica, diarrheal disease from animals can be transmitted with the blood. Orphan infection means, I mentioned that, neglected. Nobody actually remembers it. Transmission route, oral, it is zoonotic disease. Yersinia pestis, what you need to know, it's plague. Okay, 3 forms: bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic. Septicemic is the most severe. Iron is critical for successful replication of Yersinia pestis. Reservoirs for Yersinia pestis in nature. All you need to know that those are rodents. It is present in the US, in the Southwest. Transmission routes, flea bite or respiratory. Does that make sense? So 2 routes. It can be flea biting, rodent, and then human, and it can be respiratory from person to person. There is no respiratory transmission from rodents to humans. We don't breathe with rats at each other. Okay. Francisella tularensis causes tularemia. Main transmission routes, cutaneous and respiratory. So 2 forms, cutaneous infection and pulmonary infection. Pulmonary is more severe. Common reservoir, rabbits. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, cutaneous infections. Just know that it can cause skin infections, really. I'm not asking about memorizing green nail syndrome or hot tub rash. As amusing as those names are, I don't think they bear a lot of clinical significance for you now. Respiratory, pneumonia. Cardiac, endocarditis. Urinary, UTI. Patients with cystic fibrosis suffer the most. Transmission routes. It's nosocomially transmitted, okay, from the environment. It's present in the soil, for instance. Antibiotic resistance is extremely broad to the extent of being totally resistant. Legionella pneumophila. So remember, it's a gram-negative microorganism that causes pneumonia. We call it legionellosis. And it is non-communicable. So that is perhaps one of the very few non-communicable diseases that we talk about. It infects macrophages, and the transmission route is obviously respiratory. Haemophilus influenza, respiratory infections. Well, pharyngitis and otitis media. Otitis media, CNS disease, it's meningitis. So remember, we have this trifecta. That trifecta. So we talked about Neisseria, we talked about Haemophilus, and before that we talked about Streptococcus pneumoniae. Sorry. Transmission route, respiratory. There is a vaccine. Yes, it can be carried asymptomatically. H. pylori, peptic ulcer. Basic mechanism: neutralizes acid, liquefies the mucus, penetrates and infects epithelium. What proved that gastric ulcer is an infectious disease? The fact that we can treat it with antibiotics and become better. That's like population-wide studies. I'm not talking about the Marshall Warren story, but if we treat a patient with peptic ulcer, we use antibiotics, it gets cleared. Okay. Treponema pallidum, syphilis, 3 stages: primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary and secondary are infectious. Transmission route, STD. Okay. It's hard to see this microbe with regular light microscopy because spirochetes are extremely narrow. They're just too small. Rayleigh-Burgdorferi, Lyme disease. First sign, bullseye rash or erythema migrans. Transmission route, ticks. It's hard to treat when the disease progressed because it migrates, it becomes systemic and stays in the joints. Heart can cause encephalitis, meningitis, so antibiotics have limited reach in those organs. Leptospira interrogans, leptospirosis, which is generally just a fever, but in Wales syndrome, it's vasculitis, liver and kidney failure. Transmission route from animals, exposure to the animal urine and feces. It is zoonotic, therefore. Reservoirs, domestic animals. 3 major types of fungi based on their growth modes. Molds, yeasts, dimorphic. Molds are multicellular. Remember, hyphae. So you need to know 2 types. We'll talk about it. Septate versus non-septate. Septate basically separate cells. Non-septate, septa between the cells disappear, cells basically fuse. Mycelium is the assemblage of all the hyphae of a particular mold. So vegetative hyphae, they derive food, basically destroy, break down food and, absorb nutrients. Reproductive hyphae responsible for reproduction. Septate versus non-septate that we just discussed. Replication strategies for the molds. Sexual spores, asexual spores, hyphae segmentation. For yeast, so it's single cell fungi. Pseudohypha, it's the sequence of individual yeast cells, okay, that form a chain that looks like a hypha. 3 replication strategies for yeasts. Sexual spores, asexual spores, and budding. When new cell buds from another, basically binary fission, kind of mitosis. Dimorphic fungus grows usually as the mold outside as the yeast in the human body. The most likely trigger to switch for that growth temperature, exactly. Asexual spores do not increase genetic diversity, usually produced during normal conditions. Sexual spores increase genetic diversity produced under stress, environmental stress. Less frequent, but happens. 2 major types of fungal asexual spores. Sporangiospores and conidiospores. So, what I want you to know, structural differences. Sporangiospores are formed inside of the sac that is called sporangia. Make sense? Sporangium bursts open, spores are spread. Conidiospores are basically fragmented ends of hyphae. Okay, they are in the what's called conidia, bunches of spores at the end of the reproductive hyphae. They're not enclosed in the sac. Main concern of antifungal therapy: toxicity due to the fact that both fungi and humans are eukaryotes. Antifungal agents have higher levels of side effects because of that. Higher compared to antibacterial because we both eukaryotes. Polyenes, membrane disruption. Griseofulvin, inhibition of microtubule synthesis and mitosis. Flucytosine, inhibition of DNA and RNA synthesis. Azole drugs, inhibition of ergosterol synthesis. 3 genera: Microspora, Epidermophyton, Trichophyton. Transmission route: contact. So, scalp, Tinea capitis, groin, Tinea cruris, beard, Look. Tinea capitis, Tinea barbaris, Tinea pedis. Know that. That's fine. Forget about groin. Body sites commonly infected by Candida albicans. There are 20 of them and they're really small. Nails. Okay? It's just nail infection. Which fungus causes cutaneous aspergillosis? Guess what? It's aspergillus. Usually it's a secondary infection after the primary respiratory aspergillosis. Cryptococcus neoformans. Chronic meningitis in AIDS patients. So stiff neck, nausea, headaches. AIDS patients are at the highest risk. Transmission route, respiratory. Zoonotic disease, bird droppings. Virulence factor characteristic for Cryptococcus neoformans. Capsule. Coccidioides immitis. Meningitis. Transmission route respiratory. Southwestern United States. Very contagious. Immunocompromised. Okay, sorry, that's the typo. Immunocompromised are at the highest risk. Basically, you can put immunocompromised to every systemic mycosis. It's going to be true. Okay? Pneumocystis jirovecii. Pneumonia, respiratory transmission. AIDS patients are at the highest risk. Cough, shortness of breath, that's symptoms. Aspergillus. Respiratory aspergillosis, or respiratory transmission, fungal bowl, blastomyces dermatitis, cutaneous and respiratory, blastomycosis. Immunocompromised patients are at the highest risk. Any questions? Before we finish, I want to say a couple more words. So, there will be fairly straightforward questions. Which of the following 8 bacteria or fungi causes this? Am I clear? There will be questions where I will refer to, I will tell you, which of the following causes this, and then gram positive that, gram negative that, blah, blah, blah. Does that make sense? So, if you see a statement, gram-positive Helicobacter pylori, you say, that's not right. H. pylori is gram-negative, so that's bullshit, okay? There are no typos, by the way. There are no typos, okay? There will be questions that are sort of elaborate. I give you a description, like a patient comes in with gastroenteritis, reporting that they had some weirdly tasting eggs in the morning, okay? So, and you have a list, and you have to pick one that is associated with poultry and causes gastroenteritis, and it's going to be Salmonella. Does that make sense? Stuff like that. So you will have to kind of do a basic diagnostic test, not test, but kind of assumption. Am I clear? There will be questions about the toxins, the bacterial toxins. What is the mechanism? Or why is pseudomembrane formed? Because epithelial cells die, and that causes the injury, and then you have migration of white blood cells and whatnot. Does that make sense to you? So there will be some sort of stop for a second, think questions. One thing that I forgot to mention, and I want to mention it now, about these microorganisms. Treponema, Borrelia, Leptospira. They not gram-positive, they not gram-negative, they are diderm spirochetes. Am I clear? Does that make sense? They're at the very end of that PowerPoint, so just remember, they're diderm spirochetes. Good? Any questions? 45. 45 questions in the exam. Okay? Now we're going to take